Hello, I am Halise Lieberman, Director of the Taube Center for the Renewal of Jewish Life in Poland. Welcome all of you to a very special conversation. Our guests today are preeminent scholars, Professors Natalia Aleksiun and Glenn Dynner. And I would like to just take a moment for a personal privilege to welcome Fred Turna. Fred is an extraordinary individual and artist who introduced me to the importance of art as an expression of Jewish dilemmas, personal and communal, through one of his paintings, The Binding of Isaac. This introduction, hard to believe, Fred, was 40 years ago. And if I'm not mistaken, Fred included small particles of Jerusalem stone in each of his artworks. And I asked him, Fred, from what does this tradition you've created come from? And he said, Halise, I believe my paintings need to know where to go when Messiah comes, when the world will be a better place. So I can think of no better time to have a reunion, Fred, as tonight when we are discussing issues which are dear and important to both of us and to all of us here. So, without further ado, Professor Natalia Aleksiun is a professor of modern Jewish history at Touro College, Graduate School of Jewish Studies in New York. She is currently a Gerda Henkel Fellow at Imre Kertész Kolleg in Jena, at Jena University in Germany. Welcome, Natalia. Professor Glenn Dynner is a 2019-2020 Guggenheim Fellow and is professor and chair of the religion department at Sarah Lawrence College. Glenn, welcome. I've said my part for the moment. It's up to the two of you. Welcome. The Zoom forum is yours.
Thank you, Halise. And we're both honored and thrilled to be here and to be sharing with you a conversation that we've been having for quite a while, Glenn and I, on our perspective on studying Polish Jewish history as women's history. And we'll start with a little bit of academic autobiographical journey, which for me started at the University of Warsaw in the 90s, when Polish historiography was very much concerned with big questions of political history, of intellectual history, and gender really didn't exist as a category. Women's history was very much limited to what was considered the feminine aspects, such as home, cooking, child rearing. And Polish Jewish history was very much focused on arguing for inclusion of Jewish history into Polish history, that one cannot write or study Polish history without Polish Jews, a discussion that very much continues today. And then when I arrived at NYU, it was very much a transformative experience for me to encounter women's history studied rather unapologetically and not as a side, but rather as a main focus, as a window into Jewish history. And I did encounter it especially through American and Western European Jewish history.
Thanks, Natalia. Great to be here with you. And I would add also that, well, I guess my perspective is different as an American doctoral student, and then beginning my research first with Gershon Taffet and then with Antony Polonsky. It was a time in the 90s when the archives had just opened up. And so there was this opportunity to actually connect with women's experiences as they come through in the archives. And the more I got into this, the more I realized a couple of things. First of all, you know, we have to get beyond externals and abstractions in the study of history, especially in the case of a destroyed civilization like Polish Jewry, And for that reason, you know, I became much more interested in people and people's stories. And you can't just focus on male people. You know, you're just not going to get the full picture. Another thing that sort of began to dawn on me is the moral imperative that you have to avoid the erasure of women's experiences, that this becomes a very pressing issue. As you encounter these women's experiences, it becomes more and more obvious that to get the full picture, you need to include women and their interactions with men and their own unique experiences, as well as women socialize as women and so on. But there's also an epistemological issue here, because really, I now feel that you cannot fully understand key aspects of the Polish Jewish experience without the experiences of women. Everything from economic life, where women were extremely active, to anti-Jewish violence. Women experienced it differently from men, you know, sexual violence, but also as running market stalls and almost, you know, the front lines during pogroms, and even a very androcentric or patriarchal system like Hasidism, you know, the experiences of how women lived Hasidism or in a Hasidic community was very different, but also very much part of the overall Hasidic movement.
I absolutely agree. And I think that what we will try to insert into this conversation is two aspects. One is getting a full picture. And I absolutely agree with you that this is getting a full picture, but that also we complicate and possibly change how we see major questions in modern Jewish history, especially modern Jewish history, when we think about it with women at the center. And again, for me, this realization came from reading scholarship on Western European Jewry, and here Marian Kaplan and Paula Hyman come to mind with questions of emancipation, of upward mobility, of assimilation, acculturation. These are all processes that many books have been written, and probably many more will continue to be written about. And while a lot of work has been done, the same kind of bottom-up approach through individual stories, through family stories, through everyday life stories, with women being part of that, those voices that give us basis to reflect on assimilation, acculturation, and et cetera, this is still something that remains to be done. And I think we both agree that Polish Jewish history still needs to be, in a way, recalibrated with more of women's history at the center, including those big subjects of political, cultural, economic, religious history. Now, in the previous installment of the talks, Professor Antoni Polonsky mentioned mixed marriage. I believe this was in the discussion, that we don't really have a good study of a mixed marriage for Polish Jewry. And this is one of those examples. So much has been written about mixed marriages for German Jewish experience or German-speaking lands, but something so crucial is missing still in Polish Jewish historiography, but there is so much more. And for me, apropos the full picture, the title of an article written by Gershon Bakon a few years ago is still ringing in my head, the missing 52%. Now, this was an article about interwar Polish Jewry, but this missing percentage of the Jewish community, something that Glenn mentioned as not only writing through male history, remains to be done. And I want to give you, and then Glenn will also share with you some examples. We don't have enough time to go into depth in any of those. So I want to touch on Jewish politics, and you'll see a picture of Hashomer HaTzair group from Włocławek. There is endless number of such pictures one could find in Beit Tfutzot, in memorial books of Jewish communities, still in family photo albums. But it's obvious that they're girls and boys together, and this is not just for left-wing Zionist youth group, but really across political spectrum. Young women, girls are active participants in political movements. Now, does it mean that Jewish women in Poland become politicized? What does it mean for our thinking about Jewish politics? A lot of work has been already done about, for example, Bund culture, but about Beitar, right-wing Zionist youth group, Dan Heller's fascinating new book. But again, it really makes us rethink Jewish politics altogether. And again, a picture just to give you a taste of what we have to gain by this new approach. I assume that most of people who are with us today didn't hear of Róża Melcerowa. This is the only Jewish woman member of the Polish parliament in the interwar period, who was elected to the parliament in 1922 on a Zionist ticket. But she's also, a student of universities in Vienna and Paris, and a music conservatory in Leipzig, a member of a Jewish elite, a member of Jewish intelligentsia. Again, a very different lens on what we think of as Polish Jews. And this continues with questions about Jewish culture, high culture, popular culture, and Jewish education. Glenn.
Thanks, Natalia. In my own work, I've actually been more concerned with workaday traditionalist or religious women and the way they have often dropped out of the picture when we start talking about modernity and secularization. In any case, what I want to say about this is traditionalist women who are very worldly in their own way, right, working fully in the marketplace. Here's a picture, thank you very much, of a second-hand clothing dealer, but also probably rather traditionalist. You can see the wig. It's a whole fascinating, neglected dimension of Jewish modernity that doesn't fit our normal categories. And I think that a lot of women, I would almost hazard to say most women, experienced a secularization process that was highly selective, that was in tension with this tradition. And I was inspired by reading the works by Shaul Stamfer and Iris Parouche, who really looked at the ways in which working women have so much contact with the outside world, and yet their traditional education for a long time was so neglected that they were able to start reading, really devouring secular literature in other languages. And you have this disjuncture between men and women occurring. I'm not sure it was very fun for the women involved. It really created a lot of friction, a lot of tension, because on the one hand, traditionalist women are becoming more worldly, cosmopolitan, intellectually. They're opening their minds. At the same time, they're still very much captive to the patriarchal society in which they're living, the authority of their fathers. There are often misalliances as a result, which Stamfer and also Rachel Mannequin have touched upon this. And so I don't think that tension is ever really resolved, although the Beis Yaakov school system, I encourage you to look at Naomi Simon's new work on this, really is an attempt to resolve that tension and provide an intellectual inspiration, spiritual inspiration for women from Hasidic and other traditionalist homes. So that's just something that I've been focusing on, that that paradoxical modernity or secularization process for those who very consciously want to remain within the traditional world?
I like very much Glenn's stress on tensions, unresolved tensions, and my own work. Glenn and I argue about the kind of stress in this tense moment of modernity and traditionalism meeting in the lives of women. But my own work took me to a cohort that is not large in numerical terms, but I think that really well reflects the tensions and the challenges of that encounter. So all of you who had any experience with Polish universities, but this was known as elsewhere before digital era, right? This is the ID of a student, and this is just one of many female Jewish students. Miriam Litvin, for me, is special because I was able to find out what happened with her beyond her university years, and she's one of those female students who did live through the war. But she was also a graduate of the university who wrote an MA thesis on Polish Jewish legal status in the early 19th century in the Duchy of Warsaw and Congress Kingdom of Poland, who studied with Meyer Bałaban, the founding author of modern writing of Polish Jewish history, and part of a cohort of young Jews, many of them women, who were interested in writing about their own communal history. And this was something that I did not expect Polish Jewish women actively necessarily involved in. Now, they were of various backgrounds, and some of them indeed came from acculturated families, but many of them were from rather traditional backgrounds. Miriam is interesting because she declared Hebrew to be her mother tongue. This is probably highly unlikely. She was a daughter of an impoverished Jewish merchant from Łódź. It's very unlikely that they spoke Hebrew at home, and this is more of a cultural declaration. But women are very, very visible at Polish universities before the Holocaust. They are some 40% of all Jewish students. Now, if we think about what Jewish parents might have thought about sending their daughters to university, and traditional families especially, that says something about that tension. And if we look at humanities, history, philosophy, philologies, Jewish women were over 70% of all Jewish students attending. Now, this is also a question of economic prospects, but it tells us something about a young cohort coming of age, playing with different languages, some of them speaking Polish at home, some of them speaking Yiddish at home, some of them functioning in multiple languages at the same time, and studying for the most part in Polish. I look at this cohort, both men and women, in my forthcoming book on Polish Jewish historians before the Holocaust. But this cohort is not just a cohort of history writing or interest in writing Jewish history and then teaching as teachers in Jewish schools, but there are also very prominent numbers of women among medical students. And if we could look at just a picture of Tarnów, this is a picture actually according to Beit HaTfutzot from the time of the ghetto, but it shows you that this is a mixed group of men and women, and not all women are necessarily nurses while men are physicians. And if we look at Jewish journals that discuss public health, women are quite prominent, especially in regard with discussions about childbirth, care for infants, something that is very well known in Israel as Tipat Halav, stations where young mothers can be assisted in those early days and weeks of caring for newborns. This is something that was practiced by a lot of female Jewish doctors in Poland. And again, it changes the way we look at history of medicine as part of modern Jewish experience, when we realize how much women were part of it.
Thank you, Natalia. If possible, I'd like to go back a whole generation because I've been looking at this fascinating collection of kvitlach, these petitions to a non-Hasidic miracle worker named Eliyahu Gutmacher, or Elijah Gutmacher. And many of these petitions were either written for or by women. And the connection that I'd like to make is that even the preceding generation, being a traditionalist woman did not mean disempowerment. We often still, I think, ascribe to this myth of the woman as enabler of her husband's full-time Torah studies. And this did happen occasionally, but more often men and women worked together. And here is a particularly fascinating case of, I think, the paradox of empowerment, or sort of modes of empowerment within that traditionalist Jewish society in the 1870s, which is when this petition is from. This petition is by Sarah Bat-Fega, and she's a tavern keeper. She runs a tavern that she leases from a nobleman, and she complains to Rabbi Gutmacher that it's insufficient for her needs and to support her two daughters. Her elder daughter, Miriam, has just been betrothed, but she can't come up with a dowry, which is a rather large dowry. And the groom is about to go off to the army, which makes it even more urgent. But the second part of this, the second half, is where it gets really interesting, because then she says, and in addition, I, Sarah, was a widow for 1.5 years, and then I married a widower, but he's a hard drinking man, so much for Jewish sobriety. And his favorite thing to do is to play cards and gamble and other such things. And so he did not put anything towards maintaining our household. So I divorced him through the rabbinical court. Now, those of you acquainted with halakha, Jewish law, will know women can't divorce men, but it looks like she effectively divorced him by getting certain rabbis to agree to it through the rabbinical court. And I have to pay half the get, half the divorce agreement according to the suit. And the debts I owe him amount to 105 rubles, but I can't collect it, meaning she's lent out money in various places and she hasn't been able to collect it yet. And so now he wanders from place to place, gambling and drinking, and I have to provide for his meals. Then she adds at the very end, I beseech the rabbi to give me advice, but also she asks for help in her partnership in a kosher slaughtering enterprise, which she also is involved with as well. So a few things that this illustrates. Number one, there's disempowerment because she's forced to go to a male authority, a rabbi, in this case, an extremely powerful and prominent rabbi, to get help, to get advice. On the other hand, she's showing all this kind of agency, right? She's a working woman. She's fully able to support herself. She can actually effectively divorce her husband and not have to worry about being destitute because she has all this experience in trade. And I just think it's a fascinating example of all the paradoxes of that prior generation. So these very assertive women that Natalia is doing, researching, in her book, I think that the prior generation also had a certain kind of, really
possibly their grandmothers.
the grandmothers, right, were also extremely assertive in their own ways within the confines of that traditionalist patriarchal society. And as we move into the interwar period with traditionalist women, especially in what becomes independent Poland, we have the emergence of Hasidism as really the mainstay of traditionalist Jewish culture. And women within Hasidism, there's a lot of, I think, potential for confusion, because the term Hasid often refers to a man when it's referring to a strictly theological category. And yet, and Hasidism also often behaves like a confraternity, like a men's club. And yet Hasidism, as we know, was a whole religious and social movement. And women were very much a part of this movement from the very inception. And they would express themselves through what I would call submerged networks of symbols, of clothing, of head coverings, of different kinds of folkways. Women were often the storytellers and repositories of oral traditions at the respective courts. And they would often have dynastically specific uniforms, in a sense. There was the Belzer veil, there were certain head coverings. The picture we saw was of Bubover Hasidic women. And women were also patrons of these Hasidic courts. Here's Tamara Bergson, the most famous one, as well as managers, in the case of the wives of Rebbes, very active managers running the day-to-day activities of courts. And even something that's so gendered as the kitchen or as handicrafts took on a very distinctive Hasidic stamp that is passed on, whether it's recipes or handicrafts like crocheting. These skills were passed on from grandmother to granddaughter. And all of this comes together for me in the book I'm working on now, which is a study of the ways in which Hasidic men and women really created what I call a culture of resistance, meaning a subculture with its own very potent symbols and rituals that became even more important as the Polish nation state emerged, because Jews in Poland were having all kinds of contradictory pressures. On the one hand, to Polonize, to a culture, to be acculturated. On the other hand, facing different forms of discrimination and occasionally anti-Jewish violence. And it was this catch-22. And so Hasidism emerged as this kind of culture of resistance, at least I argue, that both men and women are participating in, expressing themselves in their own subculture on their own terms with, and it's very important to add, their own educational system. And if we could get the picture of the Beis Yaakov school system, this is a system founded by Sarah Schneer, and it just absolutely blossoms in the interwar period, where Hasidism in general is becoming institutionalized with respect to education. But this is even possibly more true of Hasidic and Orthodox women's education. 250 different schools, roughly, with roughly 35,000 students who are learning a combination of secular and traditional Jewish subjects, and developing what Naomi Seidman actually calls a kind of modern orthodoxy, because it's this hybridization that's going on. And I think in many ways it resolves that tension of being a woman who's worldly and educated in a secular sense, but also becoming more and more immersed in her traditions, and especially traditional texts like the Bible and so on. So I think it's just a fascinating moment where traditionalist Jewish society meets modernity in a very creative and interesting way, and women are so much a part of this process where they'd often been left out before.
So much to actually follow up on and slightly disagree, but I want to really also refer to aspects that you framed in this Hasidic traditional milieu, and I agree. And at the same time, when we look at Polish Jewish women or Polish Jewish women living in Poland, I mean, there's a variety of ways in which they would have expressed their own identity between those two adjectives. You know, for me, the fashion from the interwar period is also Jewish press advising on skiing outfits for women. Of course, this is extremely limited to a certain class with that kind of aspirations, but sport movement very much something that transforms Polish Jewry. At that time, women are part of it, and possibly we could argue that their participation in that movement, in swimming, in skiing, is almost more of a transformation than men. I also want to mention in the context of tensions that some, as I said, some of my students, some of women who end up at universities come from fairly traditional background, and the universities may change their way of looking at the world, or they may return thinking about themselves in conservative traditional terms, and that agency finds all kinds of expressions. There's of course the overarching context of difficulties, persecution, violence, and I saw some of the comments and questions. Of course, access to universities is not a simple matter for Jews, and in fact, many faculties have two sets of quotas for Jews and for women. So being a Jewish woman and being accepted at the School of Medicine is a sort of double sword situation of double difficulty, and facing the difficulties on both counts at the same time. I was also thinking, when Glenn, you were talking about this wonderful fiddle and the voice, so clearly the story recorded in it. We also wanted to mention in this conversation the difficulties with sources, sources that we have, sources that we wish we had. For me, one of the missing pieces would be to know more what women were thinking about their voting rights. Róża Melcerova, whom I showed you a few slides ago, definitely without a wig, as you noticed, was an author of a booklet about the importance of Jewish women voting before Poland's resurrection in 1918, still in the Austro-Hungarian context. And Jewish women could vote in Polish elections, but they were not voting in elections to Jewish kehilot, to Jewish communities. So this is yet another sort of structural aspect of the tension. And while I'm guessing, and in some articles you can see the tension expressed by both male and female authors writing, I would have loved to see more of it. And in general, those personal records, because of the Holocaust, so much of family archives, of letters, of diaries, memoirs are missing. And what we use to piece together also women's voices are often institutional records. For example, institutional records for Jewish female students.
Yeah, and I'm not sure where the point of disagreement was, but I do want to say that, because I'm emphasizing traditionalist women and Hasidic women, doesn't mean that I don't consider these other modes extremely important, and in their own way, they are cultures of resistance as well, certainly Zionism and the Bund and these other movements. So I'm not disagreeing at all with that. What I would like to point out—
it's a stress more than—
it's a matter of balance, proportion. We're still struggling over how many were Hasidic, how many were not. And my sense, with the historiography or the histories of Polish Jewry that I inherited in a sense, and that I was trained on, was the stress was too much on the more secularist movements, and I've been trying to provide a corrective to that. But I do want to point out, though, if we're talking about sources, Joanna Lisek has been turning up fascinating self-narratives, famous Hasidic women like Sarah Schneer, and also lesser known women in diaries and that kind of a thing. And that's where you see, I think what you alluded to is it's very blurred. You know, what does it mean to be traditionalist? A lot of these women are also going to university or are also reading avidly secularist literature, attending theater. And so it's not really such a clear dividing line either.
Sarah Schneer herself.
Yes, of course. Right. With her own theater going, and you know, Szybyszewski and everything else she's reading and experiencing, for sure. So we don't. Yeah, I think that's going to be the trick here, is how do we write about this with proper proportion to different, you know, secularization processes happening at the same time. What I think we can agree is that it's extremely rich, and tension can also be creative tension. And that's what makes this whole period so fascinating to study. And I also want to make a plug for Holocaust video testimony. You know, I've been working in the Fortunoff archives at Yale, and that's where you start to see, you know, not just women's voices, but women presenting their experiences with gesture and facial expressions, and, you know, emotion in the voice and everything else, which is so powerful. So that's another very rich source for us to retrieve these voices.
That's actually very interesting, and we didn't talk about it ahead of our session, but it's a wonderful question about the kind of auditory aspect of Polish Jewish history, the history of the ways that Polish Jews spoke, and of course there is the stereotypical image of Jews and Jewish women being louder, right, speaking more emphatically, and then it comes up in a lot of Holocaust accounts of people who are passing as trying to pass as non-Jews, that they are extremely self-conscious about not just their looks, but how they sound and their gesticulation, to not be perceived as quote unquote Jewish. But you just open a whole other window for us to discuss, and I'm looking nervously at the clock because we would love to open the floor to at least some questions. But what we also wanted to come back to is the bigger question, for which we would need another week, which is what is there to gain? And I hope we convince those of you who might have not been convinced already that there is a lot to gain by this focus, not that we are doing it first, really that this is a scholarly community effort. So I just want to give you one example from my previous work, which is the immediate post-Holocaust history of Polish Jewry, of Polish Jews, of fraction of a community nevertheless, and for what is the stories of children, grandchildren of the survivors, some of whom are part of Jewish revival in Poland since the 90s. It's been going already for decades. And a lot of these stories have a certain paradox, which is having Jewish side of the family being on the father's or grandfather's side. And this is a direct effect of the fact that the vast majority of survivors, of Polish Jewish survivors, were actually men. So those Polish Jews who decided to stay in Poland in 45, 46, 56, 68, and beyond, they often, almost by default, were starting new families, marrying non-Jewish women. So this is not necessarily history of Jewish women as such, but it's an aspect of post-Shoah history of Polish Jewry, which is deeply gendered. Without this gendered aspect, we simply cannot understand the patterns that emerge afterwards.
Well, I'll try to keep my remarks short, but it's a big one. It's a big question. That is, histories of Polish Jewry have so often followed the trajectory of emancipation, which is really a fancy way of saying anti-Jewish legislation, or laws made by men, usually with Jewish men in mind, restricting their trade, restricting where they can live and work, and so on and so forth. I just want to point out that when you look at working women who are so much a part of the society, they are actually part of a counter trend to this, which is evading and negotiating that anti-Jewish or discriminatory legislation. And so, you know, when men with beards are not allowed to obtain licenses to work on certain streets, well, women who don't usually have beards and other male markers are in a very advantageous position. They become the faces of their businesses, and they obtain the special privileges that their husbands can't. And so this could really dramatically transform, I think, the way we look at the whole trajectory of emancipation and legal history and the lived experience of really evading that discriminatory legislation. And I also want to make a short plug for Natalia's work, which has been to look at the experiences of women in interwar Polish situations of anti-Jewish violence on university campuses and other places. And you know what she shows is that women were fair game. It's just it's so hard to imagine, but women were fair game for anti-Jewish violence as well. And I think this relates to the economic in some ways, because they're in, you know, what I mentioned about market stalls, you know, they're the face of Jewish economic seeming prosperity, but also in universities, they may be the face of future Jewish involvement, even domination of the professions. And I think that's what's seen as so threatening, perhaps, and causing a certain amount of resentment and tension. And that links up to our current moment, which, you know, in American politics is so filled with misogynistic tropes and anxiety, you know, male anxieties about women in power. So I thought I'd just leave with that.
And I will just add one sentence, I promise, because this is what I agree, and what Glenn said, I think is very, very important. And it has those huge, broad implications. One of the very sad in ways in which we've been studying Jewish history along the gender lines is this division between private and public. And I think that in the case of Polish Jewry, with the work that Glenn did on inns and with economic and Hasidic women, my students, as it were, all this becomes much more open-ended. And there is a great deal of space for creative, important work that would put women at the center.
I don't want to be the one, but that's my job, to pull this part of our evening or afternoon to a close, not closing the subjects at all, because you've left us with so much food for thought, so many ideas that will require at least another visit to TJHTalks, if not more. I do want to share with you some of the questions that we've been getting and hope that we can address some of them. As I say, Glenn and Natalia, we will share them all with you, because I think not only do our viewers would like answers, but I think it's important for you to know what kind of questions are circulating around the world. I would say that one of my first, and this comes to, I think, a little bit of Robert Shapiro's question, if I get it right. I became more aware of Polish Jewish women when I was introduced to Pua Rakowski and her trajectory. And I know that's a very limited view, but it opened my eyes to some of the issues that you brought in, your traditional, modern, where women become that kind of either the fence.
And assertive.
Yes, well, right. It's sort of, but women become the border in a sense of what I hear you both saying is that on the one hand, it could be a border to keep things in, or it's a permeable border where things come and go, or do you have to make a choice? Do women have to make choices? Men also made those choices, or men and women still today make choices about where they want to be. So one question comes from Robert is, what kind of short stories or memoirs, and probably written in Polish, Yiddish, or Hebrew that might be translated into English, are written by women that would illuminate some of the issues that you're bringing up? If you could give us some thought, and even if you don't have answers now, then of course we'll add it. But the question is, to those of us, how can we access more of these, as you pointed, personal stories that some of the people are saying that was my grandmother. That's the exact story my grandmother told. So,
and I also wanted to say, if any one of you wonderful guests tonight have a suitcase in the attic at home with letters and diaries written in languages you cannot decipher, please, please, please let us know. But I will just start, and Glenn, I'm sure you have a lot to share as well. My discovery has been that there is a lot to be found on Jewish life before and after the Holocaust, actually in Holocaust archives in Yad Vashem, in USHMM, because a lot of those women writing start writing before and continue writing after, or even if they begin writing in 1939, they often extensively reflect on their lives before. So somewhat to my surprise, I discovered quite a number of memoirs and diaries that I think would be wonderful to be translated into widely read languages such as English and Latin.
Thank you.
I would add to Puarakovsky, I would add, which is really, one, Zionist socialist woman, and that's one trajectory. For the Hasidic trajectory that I've been interested in, I found The Rebbe's Daughter, which is a sort of memoir by Malka Shapiro, to be fascinating and rich. It was translated and edited by Nehemiah Polin. It's terrific. Many of the YIVO youth autobiographies have also been translated in something called Awakening Lives, which I think we should put in our bibliography, Natalia, that we distribute.
So yes, there is a bibliography, and we will also add new items. I also, if I could add editions of Eva autobiographies, which exist in Hebrew, English, and Polish, with some overlaps, but they are, for the most part, not the same texts. And they give you just a taste of an extremely rich collection that I hope one day will be even more available. But these are incredible, self-reflecting life stories of young Polish Jewish women and men.
Thank you.
And I just want to mention, I found a 480-page diary by a woman, a Hasidic woman who's a daughter of a tavern keeper named Eula Wald in the YIVO autobiographies. So it's in Polish. She's writing the whole thing in sort of broken Polish. It's just fascinating stuff. So,
I mean, the language is such a crazy, interesting, and Glenn alluded to it a little bit about this tension between how women were encountering secular modern world in different ways, and we have a sense of how much more they might have been fluent in Polish or using Polish language text, and also writing in Polish, even if this was not a language that they would use in daily life in their familial milieu.
Very interesting points that you both raised. please do add. As you mentioned, we're compiling a resource list, which is never over. I mean, it's never ended, but we will add already some of the sources that you both mentioned and alluded to. So I thank you. There's another question that we at least have time for at least one more, the question comes from Nathan Mayer, Professor Nathan Mayer. And
Hi, Nathan.
I shouldn't take personal privilege again, but I will. Nathan was, I knew him as Tani. He was a student at Columbia Barnard when I was the Hello director there. So for all of you, and to Nathan, I'm Shepping Nachas. As I understand, your book just came out. And the question he poses to both of you is, could you talk a little bit about how the experiences of Jewish women compared to those of their Christian neighbors in both the 19th and 20th century?
Oh, this is a great question. I will take 20th century, Glenn, if you take the 19th.
Okay.
Should we go chronologically?
Go ahead.
It's actually it's a difficult question, though, Tani. I mean, it's you know, I definitely think that women are working in Polish Christian society, which is the area that I'm studying, but they don't seem to be working nearly as commonly, as typically, as Jewish women are working, where, you know, the Jewish family, why are Jews considered such an economic threat? It's because each family is a double-barreled threat, where the husband and wife are working in partnership in some way, shape, or form. And that seems to be why Jews are so effective economically. Now, to be fair, Jews are also facing a lot more restrictions. You know, it's not like anybody wanted to have it this way, but Jews are facing special taxation and all kinds of, you know, residential restrictions and others. So it becomes extremely important for women to work as well. It's also sanctioned by the tradition, which I don't think is nearly the case in Christian society. So that's just one point I'd like to emphasize.
Yeah, and I agree. It's a great question, and we should definitely have another session with that question as the main subject. I would just think of upward mobility as something that might be discovered might be experienced in some ways differently. Some of it, I think, is the aspect of the perception of Jews as being better off, whether or not this is the reality. It's not entirely clear, but the trajectory of female students who are entering gymnasia and universities coming from extremely meager circumstances. And when you look at the medical school, that difference is very, very clear. So just one number that I randomly remember, that if you look at female non-Jewish students at Polish universities in the early 30s and Jewish female students, the proportion is double. Now, we can interpret it in all kinds of ways. The families are having less cultural issues with investing in women's education. Women who want to study are more assertive because of some cultural patterns. They feel empowered despite restrictions and despite systemic difficulties, because, for example, Jewish schools do need Jewish teachers. And so all these graduates of unpractical departments such as history and philosophy will end up teaching in Jewish schools. I think it would be interesting actually to look at some things that are similarly experienced, and where these moments of encounters would be happening. Would that be, again, in politics, especially in left-wing politics? I would be very interested to see how the encounters of Polish women, Polish non-Jewish women in PPS, in a socialist party, that especially in the later part of the 30s comes closer, to work closer with Bund. How does that happen from the perspective of women? I don't think that has been really studied. So thank you so much for the question.
So I will paraphrase one additional question, and then unfortunately it's time for us to sum up, which I hope only will lead to more, as we said before, more conversations, more research, more uncovering for academics, but also for all of us who are eager to learn and to also find ourselves reflected in other stories that have been told. It makes the other, whom we perceive as other, far less other, and I think that will help as we try to go over barriers and misconceptions. So I think you're opening up ways for us to come closer, at least to a very important kinds of conversation. So Emma Davis, and I'm paraphrasing Emma, I apologize, but she says, what was life, how different might life be and life choices had been between a shtetl small town life or a midtown, mid-sized city compared to a cosmopolitan city for a Jewish woman, let's say in the mid-19th, end of the 19th century?
That's another great question.
I'll leave you with one.
So first of all, I will start, but Glenn, I will be happy to pass the mic to you. First of all, if we're looking at the 20th century, and Samuel Cassel studied it among others, there is a movement from shtetl to larger cities. And although we still often think of Eastern European Jewry through the lens of a Chagall with a goat and a fiddler playing on a crooked roof, but there is definitely a movement of Jews coming to Warsaw, Kraków, Vilna, Lwów, and Łódź, including women. And again, if you look at individual stories, a lot of Polish Jews are born in small places, but then they continue their lives. Łódź is a classic example, becoming a major industrial center with a large percentage of Jews across the spectrum, from the poor to the factory owners and the upper middle class, coming from smaller places. So some of the changes, I think, and some of the challenges of Jewish women are being part of that process. But in general, I saw a question popping here on my screen, which is related, is also that Jews are Polish Jews are urban community, and Poland, throughout its modern history, is a primarily a country where majority of inhabitants are living in villages. So there is this interesting tension there as well, also in ways in which, and Glenn alluded to some of it, in which Christian, non-Jewish women encounter Jewish women, the kind of opportunities that might be presenting to both.
Natalia?
Yeah, let me just add something about villages. Often I find shtetl is mistranslated as village. Actually, Jews tended to avoid villages because it wasn't a very easy place to live. You were usually an isolated family. You'd have to go into town for religious services. And so villages were sort of maybe the least populated, ironically, least populated by Jews.
Unless you're a landowner.
Less, right, but those as well. And then we have the market town, the so-called shtetl, which was much more the mainstream Jewish existence, I would say, in the 19th century, before this massive urbanization, and it never goes away. And so there's a kind of intellectual laziness that we have to try to resist, which says everyone just moves to the cities and becomes secularized and acculturated. And that's sort of what I'm, in the back of my mind, I'm always fighting against. Yes, there's massive urbanization, but within those cities, even cities as large as Warsaw, there are thriving Hasidic enclaves, Musar enclaves, that's a non-Hasidic traditionalist form, and sometimes interspersed between, like you'll have the shtibel, the prayer house, on the same street as a Zionist or workers club or tea house or cafe. So this is all very mixed. And my only point is when we look at urbanization, we should think about it as an encounter between these forces, these secularist and traditionalist forces, not a simply one-way secularization or acculturation process. And the same is increasingly true of the smaller towns, which also have their Zionist youth groups and their Bundist youth groups, sometimes taking over and sometimes in battle, and and then the politicization of Hasidism and Orthodoxy. So even in the smaller towns, there's also that encounter. So now
the communal, but the side by definition would be much stronger. I mean, you could do things with impunity much more so, even in a Hasidic enclave in Warsaw, much less so in Otwock, because you would be seen.
Right, without a doubt. And that's why you have these interesting cases of sometimes women in Hasidic courts who live in, like, traveling to the big city and then changing their clothing when they come back, to the Hasidic court. And so, yeah, absolutely, it's easier to be anonymous in the big city, but I don't want to suggest, though, that it's a one-way process.
Absolutely.
Because, we don't know how this thing would have turned out, this secularization process, because everything was just cut off by the Holocaust. But I imagine it would have remained very much in tension, and this whole notion of traditionalism and secularism would have continued, even as it does in America and Israel today, would have continued to be this kind of encounter with all the interesting things happening at the margins.
Is there time for one anecdote from the sources, not a personal? Apropos what Glenn just said, which is we don't know where it would have gone, and then there is this tension that might have resulted in all kinds of personal choices. So I'm thinking about one particular testimony from a female student at Warsaw University who was, embracing, at least the way she narrates her life, embracing very happily secularization and acculturation in Poland, until she actually was a witness of an assault on Jewish students. And this was for her such a profound shock that she writes, as a result, she withdrew her papers from the university and decided to get vocational training and seek ways to leave Poland. So it's, in a way, life interrupted, not even by the Holocaust, but by the tensions and challenges that generation was facing.
So unfortunately, it's time for us to close. First of all, to Glenn and to Natalia, thank you for your inspiring comments, for bringing alive tensions and possibilities, interrupted lives, trajectories which are not necessarily following a dictated path, where there are boundaries and where there are permeable places, and where we might have met before in the life before. And we hope that you will join us again. You brought to this conversation and to the TJHTalks series a whole new set of lenses, which should all be together. It shouldn't be, I have different glasses for computer, and then I have different glasses for reading, but let's see if we can't make that graded lens so that we can encompass all of these lenses as we look at Jewish history, Jewish heritage, who we were and who we are. So on behalf of the team, I want to thank you for your time, for preparing, for coming open-mindedly and open-armed to the tables of educational conversation. And we look forward to seeing you at future sessions and again as presenters. So with that, I want to thank all of the members of the audience who are with us. Thank you. We look forward to welcoming you at our next event. Our next TJHTalks series will be hosted by Jeffrey Oskowitz with guests Leah Koenig and Michael Twitty on September 9th, just in time for all of us who are preparing in some way for the Jewish New Year, whether it's traditionally, whether it's secularly, whether it's just a matter of personal accounting, or thinking about how many apples we need to have and what kind of honey we want to buy. So we welcome you, and we look forward to seeing all of you, and to all of you who support our program. We are grateful.
And health to everyone.
And wishing, as Natalia mentioned, please stay healthy, please stay well, and wear a mask. Dobranoc. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Helis. Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Our pleasure. Thank you.